Okay, so somebody on the internet has made me aware. Let me actually turn on my light here. It's a little bit dark in here. That I have a quite outdated video regarding how to make a JWT REST API authorization with Neon 3. And even though it wasn't the nicest way of addressing that issue, that user had made a fair point. We're looking at a completely outdated and complicated way of doing that. So today we are going to basically replicate this, as I'm suffering from an internet outage. I have nothing else that I can do, so let's be productive. So what you see here is basically I'm using the Docker build so I'm going to link that once I can actually upload this video, and that will enable you to kind of like follow this easily. Why am I using the Docker container? Quite simple. I don't want to talk about setting up databases, credentials, installing the CLI, all of that. Let's just assume that all works, and we don't have to assume when we use the Docker container because it includes all of that. What you see here is I have the README open, so those are the steps I did, right? So I kind of like forked this and then downloaded and then cloned. Yeah, so this is what I would recommend: fork and then clone, so you can keep it up to date on your end. And then ran those commands. So build up, I already did that, and then basically log into the shell. I already did that. You can see that here down at my little hashtag sign, meaning I'm logged in as, I forgot what the default user was. Probably, I forgot how I set this up. It doesn't matter. Actually, let's find out. Let's find out. Root. Yeah, as root. Okay. So we're basically ready to go. Now, what I also already did is Neon 3 new app. Well, to be perfectly honest, I copied it in. Again, I don't have internet, but normally you would run now this command, and that would give you the Neon 3 app basically downloaded in the newest version if you don't specify a version, and place that in what you now here see as app. So they're basically, this is how this Docker compose container is set up. So this is where the actual, Apache PHP is running. This is where your source code is. And this is credentials, which is normally somewhere else. But since we're using container, it makes sense to actually have that accessible and make that easy for us. What we are going to do first is simply run this. So there are certain external scripts. So what I'm going to do, let's switch over to the coding view, is to open up basically just a browser. And so what you're going for, right, is localhost 8090. I hope that I don't need anything. I mean, the Google fonts and stuff will not load, and that's why it's taking forever, but that's fine. Important for you at this point is, so localhost port 8090 is the default setup. You can change it if you want to, but I have a, 8080 is already used, 3000 I normally need for the older Note stuff and so on. Okay. Yeah, this is not really loading, but that's fine. We don't really need this. We can see that it's running. The reason why you don't see any kind of logical content here is, again, because we're missing some kind of, we're getting, errors because everything external we can't load at the moment, but that's fine. Okay, so far so good. What we want to do right now is going to jump over to migration. If you're using Neon 3 normally, you might not be used to this kind of warning. That's because the Docker container is set up in a way where there's a so-called .savespace file that allows me to automate certain things. And that makes life a little bit easier. And I can directly work basically from here and don't have to use any kind of CLI commands. Now, first thing we kind of want to double check. So this is pre-filled to Neon 3 DB. That's correct. That is the database that basically our Docker container works with. But just to kind of like refamiliarize ourselves a little bit. So if I look into my Docker file, let's do this for now. and kind of see, this is where the safe space is corrected. Where's the setup for the database? Do we have that in here? Yeah, this is the port setup. Yeah, there we go. Right, so this is basically how our database is set up. So as you can see, everything is kind of called Neon 3, but the credentials refer to this as Neon 3 DB. Right, see, this is the name of the database from our credential standpoint. So that's what we want to go with, and that's why it's set up like this. This is something you should, of course, always change. As you can see, I did that. And then what we want to do is go to our frame as the first step. So we're going to use the pure demo frame and just quickly look into this and see how this is set up. So when we talk about providers, then you can see some of them are kind of like pre-assumed. So for example, we have this assigned provider that is giving us a JWT wrapper. That's exactly what we want. So we don't have to change that. We could change that and use like a session wrapper or, you know, whatever else we want to do. We want to use JSONwebtoken for authentication. So that's fine. This, of course, is not fine. So what we're going to do instead is to basically say we're going to read this from the environment variables to make that secure. And since we kind of need this twice, let's do the following and move this guy out. So getting our credentials. Yeah, we're going to assume that works. And then basically, as you can see now, this should, oh, this doesn't even bitch. It should though, because it doesn't really have access. So what we kind of have to do is to say, use credentials. And we want to use credentials here as well. Right, so this is our JWT wrapper. And if we do that, we can now basically say, actually, we want to have our credentials, what is it called? Auth secret. Okay. Credentials auth secret. Okay. And that should basically already work. Let's kind of like try this out. So what I'm going to do is to, first of all, before I start with databases or anything else, I'm going to create an endpoint. Let's say, let's open up our terminal again. So I'm logged in here and let's simply create this. So we're going to say Neon 3, new component, and I'm going to name this component auth. And I could simply hit enter now. Actually, let's do this time. And I say, no, this should be an API component. And I want to use a frame, which is going to be demo. And that's it. If I now open up my components, I can see that auth just popped out of nowhere. And I have this auth controller. Now, routing in Neon 3 is kind of like pretty simple, right? So a get auth, for example, would simply capture a get request to auth. And that's exactly what we want to do. And since yeah, let's actually use this for now and see what we get. So we want to get rid of all of this for now. This is all just explanation and stuff. And here we're going to say array merge. And then we're going to say params and ID is ID. I will show you that first and I'll tell you why. So as you can see, there are defined parameters here. So one is ID that can be null, and then there's params that can be empty. What does that mean? So let's go over to and actually switch to endpoints here. We hope that was going to work. Yeah, that might be an issue with our internet. Surely is. Surely is. Let's quickly fix this. Actually, let's close that one. So that's kind of confusing. Let's quickly fake this. So this is something that you don't have to do. Again, this is like if you're unlucky enough to be a customer of Spectrum, then you sometimes sit in the dark, even though electricity is fine. Let's quickly see. Again, please don't worry about this. Pretty print. Okay, we can't use this. This one we can. Okay, this one we can use locally. Let's do that. That's an asset. There's a local copy of it, isn't there? Yep. Asset, and then Alpine min.js. Pretty print will not work. Okay, we can live with that, or have to kind of. And then the style sheet we don't really need, so we're going to say frame demo CSS style. Yep. CSS, and then gaudiamos.min CSS. Okay. So this will look ugly, but at least it should work now. Let's figure it out. Yeah, it's super painful, of course. When you don't have internet nowadays, you might as well live. Under a rug or something. See what it's fighting with. Oh, can find Alpine. Oh, actually, this is kind of like my bad. So this is all web. We don't want it to read the file, right? We want it to link it. So kind of understandable that this wouldn't work. The pretty print will fail, but so it is, I guess. Okay. Fair enough. Okay. Sorry about that detour. So let's go back to what we actually wanted to do and say, okay, forget this endpoint controller. Our auth controller is basically what we want to be concerned about. So the get auth is basically what I kind of like want to test. So that basically means if I'm going to auth and say I want to have get, then let's just send this over and see what's happening. So as you can see, I have a response of 200, but there's nothing really coming through. So the params that you see here, right, those would reflect the last parameter. It has nothing to do with the naming. The last parameter is basically in a get call, get parameters, meaning that if I were to do something like some ID and send that, oh, since the pretty print, oh, that's why without the pretty print I don't even see it. Okay, let's go more primitive than that. Let's send it like this and just watch it here. Okay, so do you see how it says some ID? This is basically the get parameter. This stuff that you see here has a lot to do with the Docker setup, so ignore that. But that's what I send over. So some ID is basically what I'm getting. And you can see that the ID is still set, but it's of course null because that is basically our default. And here we said like just show us what we have. So if for all parameters before the last one, so let's say this ID, what I would do is to simply add that to the parameters of this, right? So let's just say we say auth.123. If I send this, then you can see now the ID is 123, right? I know it's kind of hard to see. I hope that's not too terrible. Can I zoom this guy here? Let me see. Yeah, I can. Okay, and so that allows us to basically, create any kind of variable we want, and this is how the routing works. So what's the plan? Well, we want to have basically a kind of like a post to auth register. And what that would allow us to do is to basically generate a new user, right? That's what the first thing that we want to do. So let's jump back over here. And so this would not be a get, this would be a post. So the body, in our case, being the last parameter, would be the body, right? So you see, the difference is just naming. So this is basically what I want to have. I want to say, okay, here is my mode, and my mode defaults to login, but it also has a body, right? What does that mean? It basically means here I can have an if statement that basically says if mode equals register. What you probably know is, or note here, is that I capitalized the first thing. The reason for that is because if I send over a string here, or actually let's try something out just to make that clear here. So I'm going to say return mode is mode. Right, that's all I'm going to do. Let's now jump back over to this guy here and say, okay, we're going to post to register. Now, if I send this, you see that now the R is capitalized. See that? Regardless of what I do here. So if this doesn't change anything, right? So you have to keep that in mind a little bit. So it always tries to do that. Why does it try to do that? Well, because if I do something like register auth and send that over there, you will see that, because it's always converting whatever a part of the string is to Pascal case, right? That's why it's doing that. So just a little reminder in case you're kind of debugging. This is a common mistake that people do, that they say like, well, I'm searching for if login lowercase or whatever, and that's not going to work. Okay, so back to our project here. So I'm going to say if this is register, then I want to create a user, right? And else, basically say whatever else we're going to do is we're going to try login, right? That's basically what we want to do. And in our get, we will use this to kind of try and figure out whether or not we have a valid authentication, right? What does that mean? Well, pretty simple. We want this to be a restricted route. Now, let's see if that's the case at the moment. So let's just go to get auth, get rid of everything else, and send this over. Well, actually, this we need to keep open for annoying reasons. And send this over, and you can see we get this nicely. Now, let's restrict this and say, okay, since we're using PHP 8, let's say authorization, restrict, and I could add now a scope here, and you talk about different kinds of permissions you can set and so on. But let's just, for our purposes here, say like, well, you just need to have a valid JWT. That's all you need. Okay, so I'm going to jump back over here and send this again. And as you can see, it's already red. And you get this error unauthorized and a header of 401 unauthorized. Right, so I do not get any kind of execution here. This is already captured up here. Very convenient. Okay, so far, so good. Now let's do the following and say like, okay, what are we going to store? So we're going to make a very, very primitive user model. We're not going to worry about, like confirm your email and all that kind of stuff. What we're going to do, and I'm actually going to leave this open just in case we have to reload this forever. Yep. So we have no models here. So I'm going to click on this little plus. This will only work, by the way, if you have the safe mode enabled. Otherwise, you will have to run a CLI command, neon3 new model, and then the name. We can do this directly from here in our case. And we're going to name this auth. No, we're going to name this user. Okay. As you can see, kind of pre-fills a couple of things. Now, what we want to do in our case is to say, okay, our user has an email and a password. And password we're going to set higher, and this should, well, who knows how crazy people are with that. None of that stuff is nullable. And actually, the email needs to be unique. Okay, that's all we need to do. And then we basically have those two fields. Now let's run this, regenerate. Okay, so you will also not see this. If you don't have a safe space, it will tell you you now have to run Neon 3 migrate models up. So if you run this in a Docker container, none of that is necessary. Everything is done fully automatically. Okay, so far, so good. Now, let's see what we want to do here. So we want to basically say, okay, if you're registering, we want to write a user into the database, right? Assuming that the user's not there already. What we're going to do for this is we're going to use a wrapper. So in this one, this is going to be not restricted, but we're going to need a model here. And the model will be user model class. That's what we need. Then our this is confusing here for it. Okay, sure. Let's be a little bit strict here. Okay, so now the user model is initialized, and I can also use a wrapper. So let's see what that will do. So here I'm going to say new user equals, and then I'm going to say new user model wrapper, and I'm going to just directly place in body here. Why am I doing this? So all the fields are filled, and basically the matching already occurs as I need it. Now let that speak for itself. So what we're going to do here is basically say, let's return a new user. So I'm going to have to write to array here. So that the API will automatically convert it to a JSON to a JSON. Let's go back over here and try this out. So we're going to post against against auth, and we're going to, in our case, do the following and say, okay, let's go back to post and let's create email. The email is going to be another user at notgoogle.com. And with the password of 123. Okay, I'm going to send this over, and if we go, oops, I made a mistake here. Must be updated array, none returned. None returned because we forgot that we have to say we're going to register. No, there we go. Okay, so as you can see, we basically get this delete date email password. So all the things that kind of like need to be taken care of are taken care of, and we can basically now directly insert that into the database. Almost. We'll get to that in a second. Now, what we want to do, which is kind of like not the purpose of this tutorial, but we have to do it because, of course, we always have to talk about clear text passwords, that they should never happen. So what I'm going to do for now, and this is not where you would want to do this, but I want to, so in a different tutorial we're going to go into this, is we're going to transform our password accordingly, and basically do this at the level of our model. So when we ran our model, it generated basically those files for us, right? That's what's happening. This we don't need at all. This is just for if you're working with front end. It's kind of like nice if you have a TypeScript output that you can then use in your services and your React or whatever you're doing. So we don't need that for our purposes. This is the database structure that we basically generated with that UI that we had. This is the actual user model, and this would be the wrapper that we're talking about. Let's talk about the actual user model right now, because what I want to do is to see how what's happening here is if a method doesn't exist, it's basically calling, this is a magic method, so to speak, right? One of those. So we're going to have a create. And what we're going to do is to kind of secure that create by going into incoming, right? And basically say, well, rather than doing this, what we're going to do is we're going to transform the password. All right, so whenever we send something to it, let's make sure that the password, it looks a little bit different. So we're going to kind of like say if that's the case, right? So if we say if the transaction request password exists, right? So that might not always be the case. We will later see why. So if this is set, what we want to do is to basically say, well, then our password equals, I want to use the equal sign to make sure that later on in my DB transactions, it's going to use exactly as is. So that's kind of important. And then basically say password hash. I'm going to use this thing. And we're going to use the password default algorithm to achieve that. Okay? And then this we can simply leave, and then we're going to send it on to, you know, whatever incoming stuff we do. Now, coming out, we never want to expose the password, right? So coming out, what we basically want to do is we want to behave a little bit different. So when we have two possibilities of, we could either retrieve one user or multiple users with any given database, right? Sorry, transaction. So I'm going to this time do it a little bit differently. So I'm basically going to say, well, is this password set, right? If that exists directly, then I want to sanitize it. Okay, so in that case, what I'm going to do is to basically, you know what, for now, let's make this a little bit primitive and say we're always going to answer like that. Okay, so I haven't thought this through. This might not be smart, but for now, that's what we're going to do. Actually, this is not smart now that I think of it. What we want to do is to unset this. We want to unset this, right? Why? Because if we update the user, we don't want it when we send it back to come in here and basically change the password. We simply don't want the password to exist from outside the model. Now, this would be the case if I'm retrieving one user, right? But if I'm retrieving multiple, then this transaction result will be an array of users, right? So it's possible that basically this looks a little bit different. So instead of like, let's just so we can imagine this better, right? Instead of this looking like ID is something and then password something, it could also look like, well, we've got user 1 with ID something, right? Let's just do that one. And then maybe another user with that stuff, right? Those are the two possibilities. So we have to account for that. In that case, of course, the password will not be set because this will be a numeric value. So in that case, what we kind of have to figure out is like, okay, with what kind of result are we dealing with? Well, it's also not that complicated. What we're going to do is to basically say, well, if this is not set and it's not empty, right? So basically, if our result is not empty, so if we actually have results, I'm gonna make this an else if. Not sure why you do that here. Okay. So if this result is not empty, meaning that, okay, I have something, but the password is not set, then what we're going to do is to basically redefine transaction result. So I'm going to say, let's make this a little bit weird here. Say, okay, there's final, and then our transaction result is final. Now, what is final? Let's just do some little bit of recursion here, just for fun. Again, this is not planned. I'm just trying to make this easy and fun at the same time. So what we're going to do is to basically say, all right, we want to do a for each in that case, and say for each transaction result as I result or single actually, let's not even overcomplicate this. Let's overcomplicate this, which just simply going to say this is self outgoing single. Okay, so as you can see here, it says, okay, we're calling ourselves, and that's correct. So we're going to basically say, okay, if the password is not set, but we have results, then we are going to call for each of those this same method, right? So this is going to run through. In that case, going to hit this one, then unset the password, and then return the rest. Right? That's simple. And that's what we're going to do. And so that way, we don't have to worry about anything else from the outside anymore. So we don't have to touch this. This is basically handling our password / exposure security accordingly. Okay, so on the outside here in our actual post auth, what we're going to do is to basically say, okay, so now instead of doing this, we're actually going to write it to the database, right? So I'm going to say, okay, this, let's try to say new user store. Yep, transaction mode should be automatic. So the reason why it's doing this is because we don't catch the exception yet, right? Oops. Okay, and actually for now I'm going to do nothing. Yeah, I'm going to do nothing. I don't know what you plan on with your error handling and so on, you know, because you would now have to look at, is this because it's duplicate? Is it because, you know, email wasn't set? Whatever. Forget that. We're going to just ignore that for now and see how far we get. The result of this will not necessarily touch new user. So what that basically means is like, okay, we could now already directly attach this to a token. So if that worked, right, which we can know if it has an ID, but I won't even go that far. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply use a little trick and say rehydrate, which basically means if this doesn't work for whatever reason, and now it's trying to update, you know, what it has on the database, this will fail, so then we're automatically in this case, right? So now I basically ensure that this is working, and then I have this auth, auth assign, and can basically say, okay, I can create a JWT now directly from it. So let's do that and say from the user get ID. Our scope is well, that's the master thing, right? That's all. And our payload, well, what's our payload? Let's just assume that we need our email for whatever reason. Need that, and then we say new user get email. Okay, actually what we probably want here, no, that's fine. I'm going to use the ID as the, that's fine. Right, so this would basically be our JWT, or actually not, this is our auth object. Okay, and if we have that, we can now basically say, okay, and now let's finally return something to the user, and this is what we're going to call token, and we're going to say from the auth object, let's return the token to the API, because we want to use this in order to validate. Okay, so far so good. And what I'm going to do for now in the else case, or I don't even need that. Don't even need that. So the login is something that you can kind of like write for yourself if you want so. Okay, so let's do this. So we're going to send this over to register. We have our email and our password, and let's hit it. Oh, auth is not defined. In 49. Okay, that kind of makes sense. We have to see what the frame setup is. Oh, it's capital A. Fantastic. What's in the lowercase a? Why did that come up as a suggestion? Well, who cares? Okay, so that's it. So now, ironically, but that's fine. We want to see that too. Ironically, if I sent this over now, I will... Oh, did I not send this to... Okay, I will get the token. Oh, it's because it's a complete try catch block. I will get this token, and this is basically already my JWT. So what I'm going to do for now, I'm going to copy this, right? And let's quickly hope that I have that in here. Yeah, I do. Okay. Get rid of it again. So do you remember that when we get auth, that we set this to be a restricted route, right? So I'm going to do this again, and you can see it fails. I get a response of 4 or 1. And what I basically want to do now, and then that's already it, is to say, hey, actually, forget everything about this. We don't care. And so that the ID does scream, we don't do this either. What we actually want to do here is to return the payload of the current user. So we're going to say this auth object get payload, right? Just to prove that we have a stateless approach here, so we don't ask a database, nothing. We're going to now read this from a valid JSON Web Token, what the payload is, so we expect this to be our email, right? So if I go here and basically press send, well, hold on, so in the authorization token, I need to paste this in, and then send it, and then you can see now it's a 200, and you can see that we now can read our email and retrieve that accordingly. Just because we now use this little helper here, what you see here is actually a bearer token. So if you go to the headers, when you write, with Axios or whatever you actually do when you use this API, you can see that the authorization header is set with bearer and then the JWT. So that's what's happening. That's what you have to do to actually implement this in a front end of your choice. Yeah, that's about it. Needless to say, if anything here is not correct, let's just assume that this is not working and so on. It will, oh, then this will happen. So I don't get anywhere, don't worry, but as you can see, this is basically a malformed error that I didn't catch. That's why I still get a 200 officially, because it is a return. So I have to catch that somewhere. But you have no chance of getting past this. So now you can basically completely work with this in a safe manner. Yeah, that's it. So now let's just assume that for the last part that we kind of need a login. Why not? Little add-on here. So if we try to log in, so let's just assume we don't know now how this works. So we are going to say we want to have a user model wrapper retrieve 1, and here put our body, right? And simply say user. There's no try here, even though this says this, but I can't remember if this actually throws in any circumstance. No entry found. It does throw a 404. Okay, so we do need a try catch block here. No, actually, that's fine. We are going to throw this 404, no user found, directly to the client if we have a wrong email. That's fine. So we're going to retrieve this user. And then basically, so next thing that we do is verify password, right? Correct. And then return the same thing that we did here. Now, here's of course now the problem. Will this work? If I actually retrieve the user, let's do this. So we, and see, because it's duplicate, be array. Okay, sure. Always be, sure. Should not be an instance of the model. So if we were to do this here now, let's try this out. So I'm going to go back to auth. I'm going to say login, and it's going to be a post. And I hope my payload is still okay. Yep. And this I'm going to completely delete. Not that it matters at this point, but just to be clear, we don't need this now. And if I click send, so do you see how I get this no entry found? Now, actually, why is that? Why do we get a no entry found even though I sent the body with the correct email? Which, let's just verify that this was actually done. Another user, not Google. Oh, we did that twice. Perfect. Let's remove one of those. Right, so when we sent the body over, we should retrieve something, right? We have this no entry found, even though we sent over the right email. So as you probably remember, when we saw this with the get parameters, there's a bunch of more stuff coming on from you know, wherever it is. So we kind of have to make sure that the conditions that we send over are okay. So because now what we basically said is we said like, well, retrieve a user where the email is another user and the password is 123, which of course cannot work because there is no password 123. We have converted it. So let's be really precise here and say, actually, please, the only condition that you should worry about is that the email is from the user itself, right? Let's try this out. And as you can see, now we basically get this out. Now, in the second step, what we would need to do is to, of course, say, well, but does the password match, right? Is that correct? And as you can see, we have created a security layer. Now, we don't have the password anymore. It does not exist, right? No chance. So how can we kind of like do this? And the answer is, well, on this level, right, we could, but we won't. So instead of using the model wrapper retrieve, we're actually going to say, okay, that's not how we're going to operate. We're going to say use the model wrapper, and here going to say user model login. Actually, for our purposes, we don't even need the wrapper at all. We're going to do it directly like this and say, please log us in with the complete body. Okay, now you can see this method doesn't exist, and that's why we use it, right? So basically, to circumvent our own security thing, what we're going to do, I'm not sure where the trade opened. So here, we're going to say, well, if this is a call static, right, that only works if the method does not exist, why don't we create a method that actually exists within this model? So I'm going to say static function login credentials. Right, and then basically say, okay, we do the same thing here. We want to retrieve the model. Let's do that. So we're going to say, instead of getting this, I'm going to use directly the DB just to have a little bit of a different flavor here. So I'm going to use the DB rather than a method of, for example, get, right? I could use this too. I could use the get method of model, basically. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say I'm going to work with the DB directly and say, hey, so what I want, right, is the user ID, the user email, and actually the user email I don't even need, the user password, right? That's what I need. Where the email is credentials email. That's what I want, right? So this found user. Sorry. Right, so there are two possible outcomes now. Either this yields results or not. So if this email address actually exists, let's basically do this and say, well, if empty found user, just kick the person out. Say throw new route exception with a message of no such user, and then let's do a 404. Okay, let's try this out quickly. So this is going to bitch because it's not in the blocks. That's fine. Let's go back to our auth controller and add, oh, because this is void. Yeah, that's fine at the moment. No, it's not. It's going to bitch. For now, let's actually please return found user, which we will never do, but just, you know. Okay, and now it says there is no route exception. So if we now try this out and we were to say like, hey, there's a typo here in the email. So another user, and I sent this over. Then I get my 404, right, with the message, no such user. Which I don't know if you want to disclose that, by the way. I normally don't. I normally, like, whatever it is, whether or not it's the wrong password or the wrong email or username, I simply say no. That has the advantage of, so people can have brute force of what kind of email exists. For example, if you log in with email instead of username, I would recommend that. But for our purposes, we don't care. So let's go back to our user model and say, okay, so that's if it doesn't exist, but what's happening in the success case. So in the success case, we basically have our found user is now found user 1, right? Oh yeah, let's quickly clarify that. So if I send it correctly, what I basically get, oops, to array, oh yeah, should probably, where is it to array? Sorry, outside here. So this doesn't exist anymore, of course. We're going to directly return this. Okay, then we basically get, as you can see, an array of array. And careful, that here is the, I mean, even though nobody can do anything with this, but still here is now the password included, right? We just passed it out directly outside of the layer of the model. So we don't want to do this. What we want to do instead is to say, okay, now let's compare if that's the right kind of password. Right, so what we're going to do is to basically say, all right, in our, I don't know why I have this stuff open here. Since we have this now, so, right, so we know that the actual user, so is the first one. Let me just redeclare this to make things a little bit easier, right, and say, okay, so the first hit is the one that we're interested in. And now basically say, all right, this found user, we now want to see whether or not it is correct, right? So now we basically say, well, if not, now let's figure this out and say, what do we actually want to achieve? We want to say password verify. Now here we're going to put the actual password, which we were sent over in the credentials, right? And want to compare that with the hash we have, which in our case is found user password, right? Then we want to throw this. Else we want to return found user. Okay, so far so good. Let's try this out. And say, let's assume that we have a wrong password here. So we sent this over, we get the 404 again, right? No such user. And if I have the right password, then I get my full result out. So that's kind of cool. And so last but not least, we now basically know that this is correct, and now we want to get the, not just the ID and password. As a matter of fact, we don't want to get the password at all. So we're going to go back to the unified logic and say, actually, let's just get the ID from our found user, and just return to the logic of our outgoing and return the complete model as we want to, right? So in other terms, if I sent this correct, then what I actually want is this correct user model with the stuff that I want. See, email, ID, stamps, and so on, but no password. So that's how I want to work with it. So far, so good. Now let's clean up this logic. Of course, we could say, well, if not found user, or, so forget this now, or not this. So in this case, we got to be careful here, right? So it's if it's empty or the password cannot be verified, then let's kick the person out, and we're going to simply say unauthorized, stupid word. Okay, let that be a 4-1, and forget all of this. Simplify this down a little bit. Okay, so those are the only lines of code we actually need. And out here, what we want to do is to basically say, well, let's get this user out. If this works, then we want to have our what we did before, right? So our auth, did we call it auth object? Yeah, let's do the same thing. Basically say, okay, this auth assign, we can more or less like just kind of like copy this before we clean that up, and in our case that would be user, right? And then we return this. Now as you can see, this looks pretty similar, doesn't it? So let's get a little bit smarter about it and say, well, okay, let's not repeat ourselves. So here we are in register, we need a new user that does all kinds of stuff. Why don't we make our lives a little bit simpler and say we call this user, right? And if we have any kind of problem with that, we're actually going to not catch this. And no, we are going to, in this case, throw new route exception and give a little bit of a malformed input, little bit stuff like that. Right now it's 6, I think. Okay, and this whole other thing here, let's just place that after our if, and then notice that we have similarities here, right? So this we don't need, this we don't need, this we don't need, this we also don't need. Okay, and then we can simplify it down to this, right? And basically say, okay, what's the real difference? So since we're in PHP 8, let's even be cooler and create a match expression. Let's not go wild. And if else is fine here. Right, so in the case of register, our user is basically a new user, and if that shouldn't work, then give him some kind of meaningful response. And if there's a login and that works, then let's basically generate this auth object. So either we're a new user or we're an existing user, we don't care. We generate this JSON-webtoken and then basically get our token back. Okay, what that means for us is that I should now be able to send this over and, oops, and in 56, let's actually verify what's going on here. 56 user. What do I return here is the question. Return self get. Yeah, what's the error? An array. Correct. 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 Let's unify this. Say ID. And here, what do we have here? La 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 la. Right. Oh, let's actually keep it like this. Here, user store. And we say user equals, because we're mixing now a wrapper and an array, right? And here we're going to say new user to array. Okay. And same stuff here. So this is now actually going to be, yeah. I could do this the other way around and convert this to an object instead, but let's keep it simple. Okay. Boom. So my login works. And I can now basically get this JSON Web Token and work with that accordingly. Okay, so that's already it. And now I can basically generate, you know, simply by using this restrict, you know, different kinds of logic. And by the way, just to reminder, so we now set all, right, in what we need here. So if I go over here, and let's now use this token quickly. Yeah, it's quite some token here. Right, and switch this over to get. Then you will see, okay, I get this. If I now say like, hey, we're basically using something else now, right? So you need to have admin, let's assume. Then you will see, boom, it fails, right? So there's an access denied. And see how it's not unauthorized, it's an access denied. So basically indicating that, well, you have a valid JWT, what you don't have is the right to visit this. Or you know, post this or whatever use it for. Yeah, that's basically it. I know this was kind of a little bit more about than you know, the simple JSON Web Token itself. So we also created this whole thing, and the reason for that is that I would have normally simply used a package that would build us the user model and the login logic, but without internet. As you can guess, we kind of had to build it from scratch, but I'm kind of like thankful for the opportunity. So you can see how to build basically completely from scratch your JSON Web Token API. And as you can imagine, normally this is easier. So if you were to now create other models, like stuff like with you know, like protecting certain things on certain levels, like the password or transforming it, that's usually not the case, right? Usually I just insert whatever I get after making sure that the permission exists. So for example, that I'm admin or whatever. Okay, cool. Thanks for watching. And I will see you when I see you.